Have you ever been discarded by your own blood because your existence ruined their aesthetic? The dark only teaches the trampled to become ruthless predators. 10 years ago, they erased me from the dinner table. 10 years later, I invited them to my wedding to watch me obliterate the empire they spent a lifetime building. The perfect revenge is not a scream, but a smile as your enemies tie their own noose. Hello to the wonderful audience of Haley Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us without a budget to keep operating. If you find today's story captivating, please consider supporting us with just $1 so our hardworking team can cover their living expenses and continue creating these stories for you. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the link in the description or the pinned comment. My name is Morgan Martin, and this is how my nightmare began. The night before Thanksgiving in Boston was always unforgiving, but that year, the cold felt like it was actively trying to break my bones. I was 22 years old, huddled inside a cheap, uninsulated rented garage that smelled faintly of motor oil and damp concrete. My fingers were stiff, practically blue at the tips, yet I kept typing. I was pushing through the biting chill to write the final lines of code for my independent software project. The harsh glow of my battered monitor was the only light in the cavernous space, casting long, wavering shadows against the corrugated metal walls. I wore 3 layers of thrifted sweaters, shivering violently, but my mind was entirely consumed by the labyrinth of algorithms forming on the screen. Then, my phone buzzed against the freezing metal desk. The caller ID flashed with the name of my older sister, Chloe. I swiped to answer, expecting a brief check-in about what time I was supposed to arrive for the family dinner the next day. Instead, her voice cut through the speaker, sharp and devoid of any warmth. "Morgan, do not come tomorrow," Chloe stated flatly. There was no greeting, no hesitation. "I am canceling your invitation to the dinner." I froze, my hands hovering over the keyboard. Before I could even process the words, she continued her verbal assault. "Harrison is bringing his parents," she said, her tone dripping with a mixture of pride and profound disdain. Harrison was her fiancé, the golden boy heir to a massive venture capital dynasty. To Chloe and my parents, he was a lottery ticket. "His family is old money, Morgan. They are accustomed to a certain standard of living, a certain aesthetic, and frankly, you do not fit into it. You are a delusional failure. Your ragged clothes and that garbage tech you waste your time on will completely ruin the upper-class image we have worked so hard to build for them." My chest tightened, a heavy knot of betrayal forming in my throat. I tried to speak, to defend the countless hours I had poured into my work, but the line shuffled. Chloe had put me on speakerphone. My father, Richard, interjected. His voice was heavy with contempt. "Your sister is right, Morgan. You are a stain on this family." My mother, Eleanor, chimed in right behind him, her words like poisoned darts. "We offered you help. We told you to take that honest, low-paying office job at the insurance firm. It was respectable. But no, you refused. You chose to live in a miserable garage, chasing this utterly useless pipe dream. We will not let your stubbornness drag us down. Do not show your face tomorrow," my father added, his tone final and absolute. "We absolutely forbid you from coming. Do not embarrass Harrison and do not embarrass us. Stay in your garage where you belong." The line went dead. There was no goodbye. Just the hollow beep of a disconnected call echoing in the freezing room. For a long moment, I sat perfectly still in the agonizing silence. The rejection from my own blood was a physical blow, a harsh slap that left my ears ringing. They had just discarded me on the coldest night of the year, tossing me aside like broken furniture because I did not match their fabricated display of wealth. But I did not cry. Not a single tear fell. Instead, I slowly lowered my eyes back to the glowing monitor. Staring right back at me was the completed core data security algorithm I had just built from scratch. It was a revolutionary piece of architecture, something no one in the tech world had managed to stabilize yet. My family saw a delusional girl playing with useless garbage. I saw the key to the entire digital kingdom. In that freezing garage, the humiliation did not break me. It crystallized into a pure, white-hot catalyst. I placed my hands back on the keyboard and made a silent vow to the empty room. I swore that I would never, ever let anyone dictate my worth again. I would climb so high that they would never be able to reach me, and when the time came, I would make sure they understood exactly what they had thrown away. I methodically saved my work to an encrypted drive. I shut down the old, wheezing laptop and packed it carefully into my worn-out backpack. I gathered the few belongings I had left, zipping my jacket up to my chin against the biting Boston wind. I walked out into the freezing night, the icy air burning my lungs. I hiked 1.5 miles to a rundown 24-hour gas station. Pulling the last few crumpled dollar bills from my pocket, I bought a large black coffee to warm my hands and keep my eyes open. I had exactly enough money left for a one-way ticket out of the state. I walked to the terminal and boarded a cheap cross-country bus leaving Boston behind. As the massive engine rumbled and the city lights faded into the dark, I leaned my head against the rattling window. I was heading straight to Texas. Out of the hundreds of pitches I had sent out, only one single investor had bothered to reply to my email. That was all I needed. One spark. I was going to build my own empire, and I would make absolutely certain they lived to witness it. 10 years evaporated into the blistering Texas heat. The shivering, desperate girl in the Boston garage was dead and buried. In her place sat the architect of a digital fortress. I was now the founder and chief executive officer of Ethirus Dynamics, a private cybersecurity conglomerate headquartered in Austin, valued at several $billion. My company secured the digital infrastructure of sovereign nations, elite intelligence agencies, and multinational banks. Yet my name appeared on zero public documents. I operated entirely in the shadows, shielded by a labyrinth of proxy shell corporations, ghost boards, and absolute identity encryption. I was a phantom in the Silicon Valley machine, holding the master keys to the world's most sensitive vaults. To the public eye, the CEO of Ethirus was an anonymous entity known only as the chairman. To my estranged bloodline, however, I had carefully cultivated a far more pathetic narrative. For a decade, I maintained the perfect illusion that I was exactly the failure they had branded me as. Whenever my mother bothered to send a passive-aggressive holiday message, or my sister needed someone to look down upon to inflate her own ego, I played the part of a burnt-out, low-level IT help desk operator. I fed them calculated stories of struggling to pay my rent, of surviving on instant ramen, and of answering angry customer calls for $15 an hour. It was an impenetrable firewall of deception, keeping their toxic greed entirely isolated from my empire. The secure line on my sleek mahogany desk glowed amber. The encrypted caller identification translated the incoming number, displaying Chloe's name. I swiped the screen to accept, leaning back into my ergonomic leather chair as the panoramic view of the Austin skyline stretched out beyond my tempered glass walls. "Morgan," Chloe barked through the high-fidelity speaker. Her voice had not changed a fraction. It still carried that grating, aristocratic affectation she had spent her entire adult life perfecting. "I need you to listen closely because I do not have time to repeat myself. Harrison just closed the biggest deal of his career. His venture capital firm acquired a massive revolutionary software project. We are throwing a monumental celebration gala at our new estate this weekend to announce it to the board." I remained perfectly silent, letting the vacuum of the line encourage her to inflate her own importance. "It is going to be packed with top-tier investors," she continued, her tone dripping with manufactured superiority. We ordered these elaborate LED display walls to showcase the acquisition data, but the useless vendor set the visual mapping incorrectly. The event is in 2 days. I am giving you an opportunity to make some quick cash since I know you are probably behind on your utility bills again. What is the job, Chloe? I asked, keeping my vocal register utterly flat and devoid of emotion. You will come to the house and recalibrate the screens, she commanded. I will pay you $300. That is probably a week of wages for you at that miserable call center, so consider it an act of charity on my part. But there are strict rules. You will arrive in a drab service uniform. You will use the catering entrance at the back of the estate, and under no circumstances are you to speak to any of the guests. If anyone asks, you are just a hired technician. I cannot have my high-profile friends knowing my sister is a blue-collar keyboard monkey. I looked down at my left hand. Resting on my ring finger was a flawless, custom-cut diamond. It was an engagement ring given to me by Julian, my brilliant chief counsel and fiancé, a man whose legal ruthlessness was feared across the corporate sector. I gently twisted the diamond, a cold, sharp smile touching the corners of my mouth. My sister was offering me $300 to sneak through her back door, completely unaware that she was speaking to a woman who could buy her husband's entire firm with a single wire transfer and liquidate his assets before lunch. $300, I repeated slowly, savoring the sheer delicious irony of the number, and I used the service door. Understood. Do not be late, Morgan, she snapped, and for heaven's sake, try to look presentable, even if it is just a uniform. She ended the call. No goodbye. Just the abrupt, dismissive click of a terminated connection. I set the phone down and pulled up the encrypted financial dossier Julian had compiled for me earlier that morning. The massive software project Harrison had just acquired was not a secret to me. In fact, it had been firmly in Aethirus Dynamics' crosshairs for months. Harrison thought he had discovered a gold mine, a hidden gem that would skyrocket his firm's valuation into the stratosphere. He had absolutely no idea that the architecture of his new prize was fundamentally compromised, an unstable house of cards teetering blindly over a cliff. More importantly, Harrison did not know that the only entity holding the power to either save or shatter that project was the anonymous chairman of Aethirus. I tapped the secure intercom button to connect to Julian's office down the hall. Julian, I said, my voice echoing slightly in the vast executive suite. Cancel all my external meetings for this weekend. Clear the schedule. It seems my sister has graciously hired me for a freelance gig. A freelance gig, Julian replied, the dark amusement evident in his deep voice. Let me guess. The compensation is highly insulting. $300, I said, standing up and walking toward the floor-to-ceiling window. The city traffic below moved like tiny, insignificant ants navigating a concrete maze. But the real payoff is going to be astronomical. Harrison just swallowed the bait. Then I suppose we should let him choke on it, Julian said smoothly, the sound of keyboard clacking bleeding through the audio feed. I will prepare the legal containment protocols and alert our forensic teams to stand by. Happy hunting, Morgan. I disconnected the line. The trap was set, and the prey had eagerly sprinted right into it, blinding themselves with their own insatiable arrogance. They wanted me to be the invisible, silent technician at their grand celebration. I was more than happy to oblige. After all, the most efficient way to dismantle a fortress is from the inside, quietly walking through the back door they foolishly left wide open. The evening air was thick with the suffocating scent of expensive perfume and roasted duck as I approached the service entrance of my sister's new estate. I wore a pair of shapeless, faded gray work coveralls, the stiff fabric scratching uncomfortably against my skin. The material was intentionally cheap, deliberately chosen to render me invisible in a house designed solely to worship wealth. I bypassed the grand circular driveway, where valets were aggressively parking imported sports cars, and slipped through the heavy metal catering door near the kitchens. The mansion was a towering monument to new money and securities. Everything was gilded, aggressively polished, and screaming for attention. As I navigated the narrow service corridors, carrying my heavy canvas tool bag, I caught sight of the main foyer through a set of double doors. My parents, Richard and Eleanor, were standing near an absurdly large champagne fountain. I paused, our eyes locking for a fraction of a second. The reaction was immediate. My mother's face contorted as if she had just smelled rotting meat. She frantically grabbed my father's arm, and they both spun around, staring intently at a blank patch of wall to avoid acknowledging my existence. They treated me like a highly contagious pathogen that had somehow breached their meticulously sterilized bubble. I kept moving. My target was not the extravagant LED screens in the ballroom. Those were a minor distraction, a convenient alibi. My real objective was the East Wing. I slipped past a gaggle of inebriated executives and pressed myself into a dark alcove as Chloe glided past. She was draped in heavy diamond necklaces that looked more like chains than jewelry, her voice a shrill siren boasting about her upcoming winter vacation to the Swiss Alps. A few yards away, Harrison was holding court with a circle of aging venture capitalists. He was gesturing wildly with a crystal tumbler of scotch, spinning magnificent tales about the limitless future of his firm and the revolutionary acquisition he had just finalized. He looked like a king surveying his conquered lands. He was actually a desperate man standing on a trapdoor. I reached the heavy oak door of Harrison's private study. The lock was an expensive biometric scanner, but Harrison possessed the fatal flaw of absolute predictability. I bypassed the fingerprint reader using a localized electromagnetic pulse generator I had built into a hollowed-out voltage meter. The mechanism clicked softly, and I slipped inside, shutting the door silently behind me. The room was dark, smelling strongly of leather and expensive cigars. I moved swiftly to his massive mahogany desk and dropped to my knees, locating the personal, air-gapped server tower hidden beneath it. I pulled a sleek, unmarked USB drive from my pocket and slid it into the primary port. This was not a standard flash drive. It was a military-grade extraction protocol developed by Aetherus Dynamics, designed to quietly bleed a system dry without triggering a single security alarm. I opened my handheld diagnostic tablet and watched the encrypted files pour into my interface. It took less than 3 minutes to completely shatter the illusion Harrison was selling to the cheering crowd outside. The truth was catastrophic. Harrison's venture capital firm was not thriving. It was practically a rotting corpse. He had over-leveraged every single asset to maintain his extravagant lifestyle and fund a string of catastrophic investments. His firm was drowning in hundreds of millions of dollars of debt, owed not to legitimate banks, but to an aggressive syndicate of shadow lenders charging predatory, double-digit interest rates. He was only weeks away from complete financial obliteration. But it was the final folder that made my blood turn to ice. To save himself, Harrison had drafted an illegal, highly classified recovery strategy. He planned to bypass federal regulations entirely and covertly short-sell the biometric and financial data of the millions of users tied to the new software company he had just acquired. He was going to strip-mine the privacy of innocent people and sell it to black-market data brokers overseas to cover his massive debts. It was a colossal act of fraud. It was a federal crime of the highest order. The download hit 100%. I pulled the drive, slipped it back into my pocket, and permanently erased all digital footprints of my entry. I had the kill switch. I stepped out of the study and turned the corner, only to find my path completely blocked. Chloe and Harrison were standing in the middle of the corridor, flanked by 3 wealthy investors. Chloe was mid-laugh, tossing her head back when she suddenly saw me. The smile vanished, instantly replaced by a cruel, calculated sneer. "Well, look who finally crawled out of the basement," Chloe announced, ensuring her voice echoed loudly enough for the other guests to hear. "I specifically told you to stay out of sight, Morgan." Harrison stepped forward, his eyes glassy with alcohol and supreme arrogance. He looked me up and down, taking in the cheap coveralls with utter disgust. "Is this the IT girl you hired out of pity, darling?" He slurred slightly, grinning at his influential friends. "She looks like she belongs on a dirty construction site, not in a civilized home." The investors chuckled politely, eager to appease their wealthy host. "She is entirely useless," Chloe sighed dramatically. She took a step toward me, holding a full, oversized goblet of deep red wine. "I swear, if the display screens glitch even once tonight, I am not paying you a single cent." As she spoke, Chloe deliberately tilted her wrist. The crimson liquid poured out in a rush, splashing violently against the chest of my gray uniform, staining it with a dark, rapidly spreading blotch. She gasped, though her eyes danced with pure, malicious delight. "Oh my goodness," Chloe said, feigning terrible horror. "I am so incredibly clumsy. But then again, a massive stain might actually improve that hideous outfit." The hallway erupted in cruel laughter. The investors shook their heads, thoroughly entertained by the public humiliation of the hired help. They waited for me to break. They wanted tears. They wanted me to shrink away in shame, to apologize profusely for ruining their beautiful view. Instead, I stood perfectly still. The cold wine soaked through to my skin, but my heart beat with a slow, terrifying rhythm. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a clean microfiber cloth I used for my lenses, and began to dab at the stain. My movements were agonizingly deliberate. I did not look down. I kept my eyes locked fiercely on theirs. I stared into Harrison's flushed, arrogant face. I looked at Chloe's mocking smirk. I carefully examined the faces of the three men laughing beside them, mentally burning their features into my permanent memory. I analyzed them not as family or human beings, but as broken code waiting to be deleted. The silence stretched, the air growing incredibly heavy and uncomfortable. The laughter slowly died in their throats as they registered my absolute lack of reaction. The unnatural stillness unnerved them. "The screens are fully operational," I said. My voice was a dead calm, completely lacking even a tremor of anger. "Excuse me." I stepped firmly around them, the wet fabric clinging to my chest, and walked down the grand hall with an even, unhurried pace. They had intended to show me exactly how small I was. They had absolutely no idea they had just thrown a drink on the executioner who was holding their rope. I slipped out the back door and disappeared into the humid Texas night. My uniform was ruined, but resting against my ribs was the encrypted drive containing enough evidence to send Harrison to a maximum security federal penitentiary for decades. The infiltration was a total success. The weapon was fully loaded, and the safety was officially off. Exactly 3 weeks later, the rusted deadbolt of my apartment door rattled violently before giving way. I had specifically rented this miserable 200-square-foot studio on the outskirts of the city for moments exactly like this. It was a meticulously crafted stage. The wallpaper was peeling in sickly yellow strips. A leaky faucet dripped a relentless rhythm into a stained sink, and the air was thick with the smell of boiled cabbage and damp rot. I was sitting on a sagging thrift store mattress, wearing an oversized, faded sweater, when my blood family marched into my curated squalor. My mother, Eleanor, immediately pressed a silk handkerchief to her nose, her eyes scanning the tiny room with absolute revulsion. My father, Richard, stood stiffly by the doorway, looking as though the very air might contaminate his bespoke wool suit. Leading the charge was Chloe, her heels clicking sharply against the cracked linoleum floor. She held a thick, ivory parchment legal document in her manicured hand, rolling it tightly like a weapon. "God, Morgan, this place is a literal biohazard," Chloe sneered, waving her hand to clear the imaginary fumes. "I do not know how you live like a rat, but I suppose water seeks its own level. Turn off that garbage television. We are not here to visit." I slowly stood up, wrapping my arms around myself to project an image of vulnerability and defenselessness. "What are you doing here?" I asked, keeping my voice small, injecting just enough tremor to sound intimidated. "How did you get past the landlord?" "Money opens every door in this world. Something you will never understand," my father stated coldly, stepping further into the cramped space. He pointed a rigid finger at me. "We are here to resolve a loose end. Your late Uncle Arthur left you a digital archive in his estate, an old repository of source code. It is entirely useless to a low-level help desk worker like you, but Harrison's engineering team ran a diagnostic on some adjacent patents. They believe one of Arthur's old foundational algorithms is the missing piece required to stabilize his new software acquisition." Chloe slammed the legal document down onto the wobbly, scarred coffee table. A sleek silver pen rolled across the surface and stopped near the edge. "This is a full transfer of intellectual property rights," Chloe demanded, her eyes flashing with greedy impatience. "You are going to sign over 100% of the copyright, ownership, and liability of that archive directly to Harrison's holding company. Today. Right now." I looked at the document, then up at them, letting my eyes widen in manufactured panic. "You cannot do that," I whispered, stepping back as if physically struck. "That code is all I have left of Uncle Arthur. It is my inheritance. It is a family memory. You cannot just come in here and take it from me." "A memory?" my mother scoffed from behind the handkerchief. "Do not be so dramatic, Morgan. It is a string of numbers and letters on a hard drive. You are not capable of monetizing it. Harrison is on the verge of launching a multi-billion-dollar platform, and we will not let your pathetic sentimentality stand in the way of this family's success." "I will not sign it," I said, shaking my head vigorously, letting my breathing turn shallow and ragged. "It is mine. You have everything else. You have the money, the houses, the prestige. Let me keep this one thing." My father's face hardened into a mask of pure malice. He stepped forward, towering over me in the cramped room. "Listen to me very carefully, you ungrateful wretch," he snarled, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating pitch. "If you do not pick up that pen and sign that paper this instant, I will personally make a few phone calls. I know every major executive in the tech sector. I will have you blacklisted from every single technology company, every startup, and every outsourced call center in the United States of America. You will not be able to get a job fixing cash registers at a fast food restaurant. You will be on the street, begging for loose change. Do you understand me?" The threat was so delightfully heavy-handed, so perfectly arrogant. They truly believed they held the universe in their palms. I clamped down on my bottom lip until a bead of blood appeared, willing the moisture to gather in my eyes. I allowed a single tear to escape, letting it burn a warm trail down my cheek. Letting my posture droop, I made a show of crumbling beneath their imagined authority. I executed the role of the defeated, trapped victim to perfection. "Please," I whimpered softly, extending a shaking hand. "Please don't do this. It isn't right." Chloe threw her head back and let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the peeling walls. "Fair?" she chuckled, looking at my parents with a triumphant smirk. "Oh, Morgan, you are still such a naive child. The real world does not care about fair. The real world belongs to those who have the power to take what they want. Now stop crying like a pathetic loser. Pick up the pen and sign the damn paper." With a violently shaking hand, I reached down and picked up the silver pen. I let out one final, ragged gasp of defeat. Under the disdainful glare of my father, the disgusted sigh of my mother, and the radiant, victorious smile of my sister, I pressed the ink to the paper. I slowly, deliberately signed my name on the dotted line, officially transferring the entire archive over to Harrison. Chloe immediately snatched the document off the table, inspecting the signature with hungry eyes. "Good," she snapped, turning on her heel. "At least you are finally useful for something. Do not expect an invitation to the launch party. They filed out of the apartment just as quickly as they had invaded it, leaving the door hanging open. I stood alone in the quiet, damp room. The tears instantly stopped. The trembling vanished. I straightened my posture, walked over to the door, and locked the deadbolt. A slow, genuinely warm smile spread across my face. They thought they had just bullied a helpless girl into surrendering a golden key. They were entirely wrong. Uncle Arthur's source code was not a stabilizing algorithm. It was a digital plague. Years ago, I had repurposed that specific archive into an incredibly aggressive Trojan horse. It was a labyrinth of intentional backdoor vulnerabilities, specifically engineered to violate every single metric of the Federal Cybersecurity Act. It was a radioactive wasteland of illegal data harvesting protocols. By threatening me, by aggressively forcing my hand, and by demanding a complete transfer of ownership and liability, they had legally absolved me of any connection to it. With that single signature, Harrison had just legally adopted a ticking nuclear bomb. He had willingly shackled himself to complete legal liability for the most catastrophic national security leaks imaginable. I didn't merely hand them the rope. I assisted them in knotting the noose, checking its strength, and fitting it snugly around their own throats. Precisely 48 hours after Harrison smugly filed the compromised source code with the United States Patent and Trademark Office, his entire empire violently collapsed. There was no warning, no polite phone call from a regulatory agency. The strike was absolute and devastating. Federal Bureau of Investigation agents and cybercrimes divisions from the Federal Trade Commission simultaneously executed warrants on his corporate headquarters. In a matter of minutes, every single bank account, investment fund, and offshore shell company tied to Harrison's name was completely frozen. He sat in his opulent office, his face the color of wet ash, staring at the flashing red alerts on his trading terminals. He had just discovered the terrifying reality of the code he forced me to sign over. He was now officially and legally responsible for the most catastrophic national security vulnerability of the decade. The immediate federal fines levied against him totaled an unfathomable $50 million, and that was before the criminal indictments for corporate espionage even began. Harrison was completely trapped. He was drowning, gasping for air in a room rapidly filling with water. Then, his private inbox chimed. It was an encrypted, highly secure message from an anonymous server. The sender was listed simply as the chairman of Aethirus Dynamics. The email was brief and clinical. It stated that Aethirus was aware of his current regulatory crisis and offered one final, highly confidential bailout negotiation that evening to acquire his debt and absorb the legal fallout. It was a lifeline thrown into a hurricane. Harrison wept with pathetic relief. Miles away, completely oblivious to her husband's impending incarceration, Chloe was lounging in her extravagant living room. She was sifting through the morning mail when she found a thick, heavy envelope sealed with a wax crest. She tore it open, her perfectly manicured nails scraping against the heavy cardstock. It was a wedding invitation, entirely pressed in brilliant gold foil, announcing my marriage to Julian. Chloe threw her head back and let out a sharp, genuine bark of laughter. She tossed the invitation onto the glass coffee table as if it were contaminated. "Mother, you have to see this," Chloe called out, her voice dripping with cruel amusement. Eleanor walked into the room, sipping a glass of imported sparkling water. "Morgan is getting married. She actually sent us an invitation. Can you imagine the absolute disaster this event is going to be?" Eleanor glanced at the card and sneered. "Who on earth would marry that girl? Another help desk worker? It will probably be a potluck dinner in a public park." "I have the most brilliant idea," Chloe declared, her eyes gleaming with wicked vanity. "Harrison has a massive billion-dollar bailout negotiation tonight with some mysterious tech mogul. But before we go to his meeting, we should absolutely stop by Morgan's little tragic wedding. I am going to wear my most expensive, custom-fitted designer gown. I want to stand right next to her in her cheap polyester dress and completely ruin her entire day. It will be the perfect appetizer before Harrison saves the company." At that exact moment, Harrison stumbled into the living room. His designer tie was violently loosened, his hair disheveled, and his hands were shaking uncontrollably. He looked like a man walking to the electric chair. "We need to leave soon," Harrison stammered, his voice cracking. "The chairman of Aetherist Dynamics sent an address. We cannot be late. This is the only thing keeping me out of a federal penitentiary." He held up his phone, displaying the GPS coordinates and the address for the secret meeting. Chloe casually picked up my wedding invitation from the table and held it up to the light to mock the font. Suddenly, Harrison stopped breathing. His bloodshot eyes darted wildly between the illuminated screen of his phone and the gold lettering on the invitation in his wife's hand. "Chloe," Harrison whispered, a tone of absolute creeping horror bleeding into his voice. "Read the address on that invitation. Read it out loud." Chloe rolled her eyes, annoyed by his panic. She read the street name, the estate number, and the zip code. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The address for the secret, high-stakes bailout negotiation with the billionaire chairman of Aetherist Dynamics and the address for my supposedly pathetic, cheap wedding were exactly the same. They matched perfectly, down to the very last digit. A cold sweat broke out across Harrison's forehead. His mind desperately tried to connect the impossible dots, but the arrogance of his family was a terminal disease. "Oh, please, Harrison, stop hyperventilating," Chloe scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "It is just a massive coincidence. That estate is enormous. It is a famous property. The billionaire chairman is obviously hosting your meeting in the main house. Morgan probably just scraped together her pennies and rented the grassy patch behind the gardener's storage shed for her little ceremony. We will drop by the shed, laugh at her, and then go inside the real house for your meeting." My father, Richard, entered the room, adjusting his expensive cufflinks. "Your sister is right, Harrison. Do not let paranoia ruin tonight. We are the elite. We belong in the main house. Let us go." Deluded by their own unbreakable superiority complex, they eagerly climbed into their luxury sedan, enthusiastically pressing the accelerator as they drove straight toward the guillotine I had built for them. When they finally arrived at the sprawling, fortified gates of the estate, their breath caught in their throats. The driveway was entirely lined with a fleet of the most expensive supercars on the planet. Security personnel equipped with earpieces patrolled the perimeter. Walking up the grand marble steps were the most powerful politicians in the country, legendary tech titans, and ruthless venture capitalists. Chloe adjusted her diamond necklace, practically vibrating with excitement. "Look at this," she whispered in awe to her parents. "The chairman really pulled out all the stops for Harrison. This is a coronation." They stepped out of their car, completely blind to the reality of their situation. They genuinely believed this magnificent display of wealth and power was meant to celebrate them, eagerly walking through the massive oak doors and stepping right onto the trap door. The sweeping acoustics of a live symphony orchestra filled the cavernous grand hall of the estate. My family stood frozen near the entrance, their eyes darting wildly around the room. They were completely surrounded by the absolute apex of global power. Governors, tech magnates, and banking titans mingled under chandeliers that cost more than my parents had earned in their entire lifetimes. Harrison was sweating profusely, frantically scanning the crowd for the mysterious chairman. Then, the music swelled, shifting into a powerful, commanding march. The massive mahogany doors at the top of the grand marble staircase slowly swung open. A collective hush fell over the elite crowd. Every face turned upward. I stepped out onto the landing. I was not wearing cheap gray coveralls or oversized thrift store sweaters. I was draped in a breathtaking, custom-designed haute couture gown woven from silk and imported lace, trailing dramatically behind me. My posture was flawless. I radiated the absolute, unquestionable authority of a queen surveying her sovereign territory. Standing tall beside me, looking devastatingly sharp in a bespoke tuxedo, was Julian. We began our descent down the sweeping marble stairs. Below us, the color drained entirely from my family's faces. My father stumbled backward, physically knocking into a waiter. My mother's jaw dropped so low she looked unhinged. Harrison swayed on his feet, his eyes bulging as if he were witnessing a ghost taking physical form. But Chloe completely lost her mind. The fragile, manufactured reality she had lived in for a decade shattered into a million pieces. "Fraud!" Chloe suddenly shrieked, her voice tearing through the dignified silence of the hall. She pointed a shaking finger at me, her face flushed red with manic hysteria. "She is a fraud! That is my sister! She is a broke, pathetic call center worker. She is a liar. Arrest her. She is pretending to be rich." The entire room stared at her. The billionaires and politicians did not look at Chloe with shock or intrigue. They looked at her with profound, icy disgust. They looked at her as if she were a filthy, raving animal that had somehow wandered into a sanctuary. I reached the bottom of the staircase and stopped. The crowd naturally parted for me, clearing a wide path. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. When you hold absolute power, a whisper is louder than a scream. My eyes sliced through Chloe, completely dismissing her pathetic outburst, and locked dead onto Harrison. His knees finally buckled. He collapsed onto the polished marble floor, unable to support his own weight. "Welcome to my empire, Harrison," I said, my voice echoing like cold steel across the grand hall. "I am the chairman of Aetheris Dynamics, and your bailout negotiation is officially denied." A strangled, wretched gasp escaped Harrison's throat. He tried to speak, to beg, but no words came. Julian stepped forward, crossing the invisible boundary my family was too terrified to breach. He held a thick stack of finalized legal documents. With a flick of his wrist, he dropped the heavy files directly onto the floor in front of Harrison. They hit the marble with a terrifying final smack. "Harrison," Julian announced, his voice carrying the undeniable weight of a legal executioner. "Aetheris Dynamics has aggressively purchased every single ounce of your toxic debt from the shadow syndicates. You do not owe them any more. You owe us. We are calling in the full balance immediately. As of this exact second, we have seized your firm, we have seized your offshore accounts, and we are foreclosing on your estate. You have absolutely nothing left. The federal authorities are waiting outside to escort you to prison." I looked at my parents, who were shaking violently, and then back to my sister. I let a slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. "I really must thank you, Chloe," I said smoothly. "And you too, Mother and Father. You were all so incredibly kind to storm into my apartment and force me to sign over that old archive. You were so desperate to steal from me that you blindly handed Harrison a federal cyber terrorism charge. You literally fastened the noose around his neck with your own hands." The realization hit them like a runaway train. They had not outsmarted me. They had been utterly and completely manipulated. Eleanor broke. My mother dropped to her hands and knees, crawling across the floor toward the hem of my gown. Tears streamed down her ruined makeup. "Morgan, please," she wailed, her voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "We are your family. We are your blood. We did not know. Please, you have to forgive us. You have to save us." I looked down at the woman who had thrown me into the freezing cold a decade ago. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no anger, just the cold void of a deleted file. I calmly reached down and firmly swatted her reaching hand away from my dress. "I have no family," I declared, my words echoing with chilling finality. "Blood means absolutely nothing to me. You erased me from your table 10 years ago. Today, I am erasing you from existence." I raised 2 fingers in the air. Immediately, A dozen heavily armed private security contractors stepped out from the shadows. "Remove these traitors from my property," I commanded. "Throw them out the back door." The guards grabbed my screaming mother, my silent, broken father, my hysterical sister, and dragged Harrison's limp body across the floor. They were hauled out of the grand hall, their cries fading into the humid night, permanently banished from the world of power they had so desperately worshipped. I turned away from the door, linking my arm back through Julian's. The orchestra smoothly transitioned into a magnificent, triumphant wedding march. The elite crowd erupted into thunderous applause, bowing their heads in deep respect as we walked forward. I stepped onto the brilliant aisle, bathed in absolute glory, leaving behind a hollow, shattered bloodline that had finally been ground into dust. Thank you so much to our wonderful listeners for staying with me until the very end of this story. I would absolutely love to know where you are listening from today, so please drop your location in the comments below. If you found today's story satisfying and entertaining, please help us keep this channel alive by donating just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen, or by clicking the PayPal link in the description or the pinned comment. Your support is the only way we can pay our incredibly hardworking staff, helping them feed their families and continue creating these amazing stories for you. Thank you again, and have a beautiful day.